Rain hammered the porch roof the night my husband handed me a garbage bag instead of an umbrella. 20 years of marriage, and Aaron stood in the doorway of the house I had scrubbed, painted, and prayed in, looking at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd overstayed a visit. His mother's ashes weren't even cold in the ground. "I only needed you to take care of my mother," he said, calm as a man reading a grocery list. I waited for him to laugh, to say it was a bad joke. He didn't. He told me to pack. He told me not to expect anything. I want to tell you how I got there, standing on my own front steps with a suitcase and no coat, because it didn't happen in one night. It happened over 3 years, one small erosion at a time, the way a riverbank disappears without anyone noticing, until the house built on it starts to lean. My name is Rachel Nelson. I'm 45 years old, and until 3 years ago I taught 3rd grade at Maple Hill Elementary. I loved that job with the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything back. The smell of pencil shavings, the sound of 26 kids reciting the alphabet off key, the way a shy child's face would open up like a window when they finally understood long division. I gave it up the year Evelyn, my mother-in-law, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Aaron said his mother needed someone she trusted, someone patient, someone who wouldn't put her in a home like she was furniture nobody wanted anymore. He said it would be temporary. He said we'd hire help eventually. Eventually never came. So I left my classroom. My kids, my grade book still half filled with November's spelling scores, and I became a full-time caregiver. I learned how to cut Evelyn's food into small pieces so she wouldn't choke. I learned the exact rhythm of her physical therapy exercises, the exact volume of voice that didn't startle her, the exact songs from the 1960s that could pull her back from wherever her mind had wandered to. There were days she looked at me and called me by her sister's name, a woman who'd been dead for 30 years. There were days she didn't know her own son's face when he walked through the door for 5 minutes before leaving again for work. But she always knew mine. Always. Even in her worst hours, when the disease had taken almost everything else, some part of her recognized me as someone safe. Aaron, meanwhile, climbed. He was a sales director for a medical device company, the kind of man who measured his worth in quarterly numbers and steakhouse dinners with executives. He was good at his job, I'll give him that. He was good at looking successful, at shaking the right hands, at wearing the right watch. Our neighbors thought he was a saint for keeping his mother out of a nursing home. They had no idea I was the one who hadn't had a full night's sleep in 3 years. They had no idea I hadn't seen a movie in a theater, hadn't gone out to dinner with a friend, hadn't bought myself a new coat, because every spare dollar and every spare hour belonged to a woman who wasn't even my own mother. I didn't resent Evelyn. I want to be clear about that. I loved her in the strange, quiet way you love someone you've nursed through their worst days. What I resented, what I didn't even let myself name as resentment for a long time, was Aaron's absence. Not just physical absence, though, there was plenty of that. Business trips that stretched longer than they needed to. Dinners he forgot to come home for. Something colder, something I couldn't put words to. A husband who stopped asking how I was doing because he already assumed the answer didn't matter. I used to lie awake next to him on the nights he was actually home and listen to him breathe, wondering when exactly we'd become 2 people sharing a mailing address instead of a marriage. I never asked him directly. I told myself it wasn't the right time, that Evelyn needed stability, that I couldn't afford to blow up our home while she was still alive, and needed both of us, even if both of us had become mostly just me. Looking back now, I think some small, quiet part of me already knew how this would end. You don't spend 3 years being someone's unpaid nurse and unpaid wife without a certain numbness setting in, a bracing for the moment the other shoe drops. I just didn't expect the shoe to drop the same week we buried his mother. I didn't expect him to wait until the flowers on her grave hadn't even wilted before he told me flatly that my usefulness had an expiration date. But that's exactly what happened. And that's where I have to take you back to the porch, the rain, the garbage bag in his hand instead of an umbrella, and the words that ended 20 years in 11 seconds. I stood there in the downpour, soaked through before I even reached the sidewalk, and I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. I didn't scream, I didn't beg him to reconsider. I just picked up my suitcase and walked, because some part of me, some part that had been quietly gathering evidence for 3 years, already knew I wasn't losing a home that night. I was finally leaving one I'd never really had. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I reached the end of the driveway. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "Rachel, don't leave town. Evelyn left something only for you. 3 weeks before Evelyn died, she had one of those rare mornings where the fog lifted almost completely, and for a few hours she was entirely herself again. I remember it so clearly because those mornings had become so few and far between that I'd learned to treasure them the way you treasure the last warm days before winter. I was reading to her from an old paperback of Little Women, one of her favorites from childhood, when she reached over and put her hand on mine. Her grip was thin but steady. "Rachel," she said, and there was nothing hazy in the way she said my name, no hesitation, no searching. "Promise me something." I set the book down and told her anything. She looked at me with eyes that seemed for that 1 hour entirely clear. "Promise me you'll never let Aaron decide your worth." I laughed it off gently the way you do with someone whose mind drifts in and out, and told her not to worry about things like that. She squeezed my hand harder. "I mean it," she said. "I've watched him. He's my son, and I love him, but I've watched him treat you like hired help for 3 years, and I won't say it again. So listen now, don't let him decide what you're worth." Then, as quickly as the clarity had come, it began to slip, and within the hour she was calling me by her sister's name again, asking if I'd fed the chickens on their old farm in Ohio, a place that hadn't existed in 60 years. I didn't understand not then how much weight was in that sentence. I filed it away as one of Evelyn's lucid moments, touching but confusing the kind of thing dementia patients say that sounds profound, because we want it to mean something. I had no idea she'd spent the 2 years prior sitting across a desk from a lawyer named Grace Morgan, rewriting the entire architecture of her estate in absolute secrecy. During those final weeks, Aaron grew more distant than I'd ever known him to be. He was traveling constantly, or claiming to be. His phone, which used to sit face down on the kitchen counter, started staying in his jacket pocket, buzzing against his chest at dinner, at which point he'd excuse himself to the garage to take a work call. I noticed the name Melissa appearing on his lock screen more than once. Melissa Carter, a colleague from his office, someone I'd met exactly twice at company holiday parties, someone who always smiled at me a beat too long like she was calculating something. I noticed. I want to be honest with you. I noticed and I said nothing. I didn't check his phone. I didn't follow him to the garage and press my ear to the door. I told myself I was too tired to fight, too consumed with turning Evelyn every 2 hours so she wouldn't develop bed sores. Too depleted to have the kind of confrontation that would blow apart whatever thin structure was still holding our house together. Some women would call that weakness. I call it survival triage. You can only carry so much weight before you have to set something down, and I chose for those final weeks to set down my suspicion so I could carry Evelyn instead. She passed on a Tuesday morning in early spring with the window cracked open because she'd always loved the smell of rain, and with my hand wrapped around hers exactly the way it had been for 3 years of mornings. She didn't struggle. Her breathing simply slowed, then stopped like a tide going out for the last time. I sat with her for almost 20 minutes before I called anyone, because I wasn't ready to let the world back into the room yet. When Aaron finally arrived 45 minutes after I called him, still smelling faintly of a restaurant I didn't recognize, he stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his mother's body with an expression I can only describe as inconvenienced. No tears, no collapse, just a long exhale like a man relieved of a scheduling conflict. I told myself grief looks different on everyone. I told myself he was in shock. But something in me, some quiet observer who'd been watching our marriage from a slight distance for years, now filed that moment away too, next to the phone buzzing against his chest, next to the business trips that didn't quite add up, next to Evelyn's hand gripping mine, with a strength that shouldn't have still been in her. The funeral was small, dignified, exactly the kind of understated affair Evelyn would have wanted. Aaron gave a short, polished eulogy that sounded like it had been written by someone who'd read about grief rather than felt it. Neighbors offered casseroles and condolences. I stood at the graveside in a black dress I hadn't worn since my own mother's funeral, and I felt strangely calm, the calm of a woman who has already cried every tear she has in private alone at 2 a.m. over the course of 3 long years. It was only after the last guest left, after Aaron had gone back inside to pour himself a drink, that my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I didn't recognize the number, and I was exhausted down to my bones. But something told me to pick up. "Mrs. Nelson." The woman on the other end said, her voice measured and professional. "My name is Grace Morgan. I was your mother-in-law's attorney." She instructed me very specifically to wait exactly 7 days after her funeral before contacting you." There was a pause, and I could hear papers shifting on the other end of the line. "There are things you need to know, Rachel. Things Evelyn made sure of long before she got sick. I'll call you again in 7 days." The line went dead before I could ask a single question. The 7 days after Evelyn's funeral passed like a held breath. I didn't mention Grace Morgan's call to Aaron. I told myself I was waiting for her to call back before I said anything, but if I'm honest, some instinct in me, the same one that had been quietly cataloging every small betrayal for months, told me to keep it to myself a little longer. On the 7th day, I finally worked up the courage to tell Aaron I wanted to go back to teaching. I'd started thinking about it the moment Evelyn passed, some small flicker of my old self stirring back to life for the first time in 3 years. I brought it up over dinner tentatively the way you test ice before putting your full weight on it. I told him Maple Hill Elementary had an opening for the fall semester, that my old principal had actually reached out when she heard about Evelyn, that I thought it might be good for both of us to have some normalcy again. Aaron set down his fork very deliberately. He looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd suggested something faintly ridiculous. "Teaching," he repeated like the word itself tasted bad. He said I'd been out of the classroom for 3 years, that education had moved on without me, that I'd be lucky if they let me grade papers, let alone run a room full of 8-year-olds. He said it with a small condescending laugh that I'd heard more times over the years than I wanted to admit, a laugh that always made me feel about 2 inches tall. I told him I wanted to try anyway. That's when his face changed, and I watched 20 years of carefully maintained politeness drain out of it all at once. "You want to try," he said. "Rachel, I only needed you to take care of my mother." He said it flatly, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. I sat there, fork frozen, halfway to my mouth, waiting for him to soften it, to explain it away, to tell me he didn't mean it the way it sounded. He didn't. He kept going, his voice rising with something that had clearly been building for a long time. He told me he'd tolerated 3 years of a marriage that had stopped meaning anything to him because his mother needed a full-time caretaker and he couldn't afford a professional one without touching his savings. He told me that was the only reason he hadn't already asked for a divorce. "Now she's gone," he said. "So are you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the spare house key, the one I'd given him a copy of years ago in case he ever locked himself out, and set it on the table between us, like a period at the end of a sentence. Then he stood, walked to the front door, and opened it. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and rain was already starting to needle down against the porch steps. I remember standing up very slowly. I remember my hands not shaking, which surprised me because everything else in me felt like it had been struck by lightning. I went upstairs, packed a single suitcase with the essentials. I didn't even take half of what was mine, and walked back down past him without a word. He didn't help me. He didn't apologize. He just watched, arms crossed, as I stepped out into the storm with my life reduced to 1 bag and no umbrella. Nobody stopped me on the walk to the motel 3 blocks away, the one with the flickering vacancy sign I'd driven past 100 times without ever really seeing it. Nobody offered a ride. I hadn't told a single friend or family member what had happened yet, because I genuinely didn't know how to say the words out loud. 20 years and I was walking through a rainstorm with a suitcase like a woman half my age fleeing a bad first date. I checked into a room that smelled faintly of bleach, and old carpet sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, and finally let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. I didn't cry, not right away. I just sat there soaked to the bone, staring at a television I never turned on, feeling something strange settle over me. Not devastation exactly, but a kind of grim clarity, like fog finally burning off a landscape you'd been driving through blind. My phone rang once that night. Grace Morgan's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering, and then let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready. Whatever she had to tell me, it could wait 1 more night. I needed to just breathe first. Back at the house, Aaron poured himself a scotch, and according to what I'd learned much later, called Melissa before he'd even finished his first glass. "It's done," he told her, his voice loose and satisfied. "I'm finally free." He told her he could see them building something real now, something without the weight of a sick old woman and a wife who'd stopped being useful to him. He told her the house was his, the future was his, and nothing was standing in his way anymore. He had no idea, sitting there with his drink and his certainty, exactly how wrong he was. At 8:30 that evening, freshly showered and feeling lighter than he had in years, Aaron pulled his car into the driveway of the home he believed was entirely his. But as his headlights swept across the front of the house, he saw something that made him ease his foot off the brake. 2 black SUVs were already parked at the curb waiting. For a moment, Aaron sat frozen behind the wheel, his mind scrambling through a list of possibilities. A break-in, a neighbor's emergency, some kind of mistake. He told himself it had nothing to do with him, that whatever this was would sort itself out, and he could go inside and finish his drink in peace. He was wrong about that, too. He stepped out of the car, slowly gravel crunching under his shoes, rain still falling in a steady drizzle that had softened from the earlier downpour. A man in a dark suit stepped forward from beside the first SUV, polite but immovable, and asked him to wait a moment. Aaron's confusion tightened into irritation, the particular irritation of a man used to being the one who gave instructions, not received them. "This is my house," he said. "Who exactly are you people?" That's when Grace Morgan stepped out of the second vehicle, a slim leather folder tucked under one arm, her expression calm in the specific way of someone who has done this exact thing many times before and feels no need to rush it. She introduced herself. She told him she'd been Evelyn's attorney for the past several years and that she was here to formally execute the terms of Evelyn's estate. Aaron's irritation flickered just briefly into something like unease, though he covered it quickly with a scoff. He told her he already knew the terms of his mother's estate. He'd seen the will years ago. The house was his, same as it had always been meant to be. Grace opened the folder, and without any particular drama in her voice, explained that the will Aaron was thinking of had been superseded 2 years earlier by a revocable living trust, one that Evelyn had established quietly, with full legal capacity, well before her diagnosis had progressed to the point where her competency could be questioned. Under the terms of that trust, the house had never belonged to Aaron at all. It had remained solely in Evelyn's name until her death, at which point ownership would transfer in its entirety to whoever had served as her full-time primary caregiver through the end of her life. Aaron laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound. He said that was absurd, that no court would uphold something like that his mother wouldn't have done this to her own son. Grace, unmoved, turned a page in her folder and read the relevant clause aloud, her voice, even and precise. The language was unambiguous. The caregiver was named specifically, Rachel Ann Nelson. I want to tell you I felt some surge of triumph hearing about this later, some vindicated satisfaction watching my husband's certainty crumble in his own driveway. But when Grace told me the story afterward over coffee in her office, what I actually felt was something quieter and heavier, the realization that Evelyn had spent her last lucid years quietly building me a lifeboat, stitching it together in secret, because she knew long before I let myself admit it exactly what her son was capable of. Aaron's voice rose in the driveway that night, according to the neighbor who later told me she'd watched the whole thing from her window with her hand over her mouth. He told Grace this was insane, that he'd contest it, that no piece of paper was going to take his childhood home away from him. Grace, still perfectly composed, informed him that contesting a properly executed trust, prepared by independent legal counsel with documented medical evaluations, confirming Evelyn's competency at the time of signing, would be an extremely uphill battle, and an expensive one. She then handed him a formal notice. He had 48 hours to vacate the premises. I arrived at the house the next morning at Grace's request, still wearing yesterday's clothes because I hadn't packed for more than a single overnight. Aaron was standing in the front hallway when I walked in, surrounded by half-filled boxes, his face a mixture of fury and something rawer underneath it, something that almost looked like fear. He turned on me the moment he saw me. "You planned this," he said, his voice cracking with the effort of controlling it. "You and my mother behind my back for years. You knew this whole time." I stood in the doorway of the house I'd scrubbed and painted and grieved in, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the urge to shrink, to apologize, to smooth things over, the way I'd smoothed over every hard edge of our marriage for 2 decades. I looked at him steadily. Rain still dripping off the hem of my coat onto the hardwood floor Evelyn had always asked me to mop on Sundays. "No," I said. "Your mother did." He didn't have anything to say to that. He just stood there among his half-packed boxes in a house that had already stopped being his, staring at a wife he'd told to leave with nothing, only to discover that she was the one thing his mother had made certain he couldn't take away. Moving back into the house didn't feel the way I expected it to. I thought there'd be some triumphant sense of reclaiming what was mine, but instead, for the first few weeks, every room felt haunted by a version of my life I was trying to leave behind. The kitchen still smelled faintly like Evelyn's chamomile tea. The hallway still had the small scuff marks from her walker worn into the hardwood over 3 years of slow, careful laps back and forth for exercise. I'd walk past her old room and still expect for one disorienting second to hear her calling my name. I gave myself 2 weeks to sit with all of it before I let myself think about anything else. Then I called Maple Hill Elementary. My old principal, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Diane who'd sent flowers to Evelyn's funeral, didn't hesitate. She said the 3rd grade position was still open, that half the staff had asked about me over the years, that she'd be thrilled to have me back the moment I was ready. I cried on the phone with her, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes from a door opening instead of one closing. 3 weeks later, I stood in front of a classroom full of 8-year-olds, again chalk dust on my sleeve, and felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in years. It was through the school that I met Daniel Brooks. His daughter Emma was in my class, a bright, quiet girl who reminded me of the kind of student I used to write future architect jokes about in report card comments. Turns out her father actually was one. Daniel was a widower, his wife having passed